Hello, welcome back to my channel. I'm E.G. Stone, and this week we're going to be talking about conlangs and sci-fi. So I've done a video on conlanging before with some sort of tips and tricks and ways to use it, as well as a few resources for actually creating your own conlang. Now this week I'm going to be talking more about specific applications of conlangs in sci-fi. So I'm going to be talking about books, and I'm going to be talking about film and television and how the two differ and how you can still use conlangs in each to sort of illustrate your story and get your point across. I see a lot of questions come up in terms of conlanging for how prevalent the constructed language should be in your novel and how much you should expect your readers to be able to follow and to pay attention to and hold in their brains, and sort of how much you can put in a novel and how much you should put in a novel. So I'm going to give you some examples of what people have done in the past, and these are all traditionally well-published authors that you should probably know. You might not know all of them, but you'll certainly know some. And how you can see the difference between that in books and what you see in television and movies. So I actually wrote my undergraduate thesis on conlanging and how science fiction books specifically involve conlangs and linguistic theory. So I'm going to be talking about some of the books that I used in my undergraduate thesis without the linguistic theory, which I can get into at another time if you are interested, because it is one of my most favorite topics. So without further ado, let's get started on some of these books. So the first one that I'd like to talk about is Babel 17 by Samuel R. Delany. This is a science fiction book that actually features a linguist as the main character. Now, she is taking control of a spaceship to go out and solve a problem involving language for government types. So this focuses specifically on her role as a linguist and the language itself. However, the language is never actually seen or read by the readers. We know of features that it has, and we know the reactions that people have to it and the results that the language brings and in what context, but we don't actually see any actual production of the language itself. Now, this is a very interesting way to go about talking about conlang, because you don't need to have any knowledge of linguistics or of language to be able to understand what's going on, even though it is such a huge part of the story. The main issue here is that it is a computer language that has been translated into human language or to natural language and being produced by living beings. So you have lack of a first-person pronoun, which leads to a lack of sense of self, because you cannot refer to yourself without a first-person pronoun. You also can't refer to others as well. You have to, so how do you relate that, and what's the point? What is the purpose of this language? So that was a huge point in Babel 17, and it is a very fascinating book that deals a lot with language and concepts of linguistics without actually going into specific detail. From a lay perspective, you don't need to have the background to be able to understand and enjoy this book. So another book that does deal with conlang in a different way is C.S. Lewis's Out of the Silent Planet. Now, this book also features a linguist as the main character, but the fact that he is a linguist is more coincidence for the situation than it is central to the story. Ransom, the main character, is sort of kidnapped and taken to another world, in this case Mars, and he is sort of thrust into this society that has multiple different languages that are all based on the same root, and he is learning the Sorn version of that language. So Lewis wanted the language to be sort of a connection to the original language, to the divine language, so it's very much dealing with things in their essence, and he talks about that. You also see actual productions of the language, but you only see a few. I think there are 5 or 6, I think. And then once you see those few productions, you understand that the main character is speaking in that language and dealing with the other languages that are similar in a very sort of similar way. The few instances that we do see the language don't require do require a few more pieces of background knowledge regarding linguistics, because it talks about verb conjugation and such. So if you haven't had any experience learning a language or doing linguistics, then that could be a little bit confusing, but it is not essential to the story, so you can sort of skip over it if that's not your thing. However, it talks later about the importance of the language and the translation that Ransom does for the people of Paralandra and the Earth types. So he talks about the translation, and the way that he talks about the translation is important, but doesn't have linguistic theory or productions of the language itself. So there are a few other examples of conlangs in science fiction books, mostly on the dystopian scale, that I have seen personally, but there are many others that I have not seen and that I'm probably forgetting. But these two books deal with conlangs in a specific way in that they have them, but they don't necessarily produce them in the books themselves. They don't require you to understand linguistic theory or to be able to produce the language or even know what it sounds like. Lewis does provide actual words that you can look at, and I believe there is a gloss in the back of the book, but I'm not entirely sure on that one. It might not have been. I'm not sure. They don't require you to know the language. They just require you to understand that there is a different language involved and that it does characterize the people and the situation and the story. Now, that being said, television and film are a completely different ballgame. This is where you see most examples of invented languages in a much larger form, specifically with sci-fi. So you all know probably about Star Trek and Klingon, and I am not going to talk about that except to say that it is a fully fledged language that people use in the shows and out. So I'm going to be talking about two other shows, Stargate, specifically the original series, and Babylon 5. So Stargate is one of the long-running series, sci-fi series, and it features a linguist/archaeologist as one of the main characters. And the reason this is important is because of the premise of the show is that parasitic aliens came and took humans from Earth some millennia ago in order to populate the galaxy as slaves. And so original, early dialects of languages that are dead or have evolved significantly show up in this show for that reason, and so that becomes important to understand the culture of the people and how it evolved, and also the struggles of the main character. Now, you actually get to hear productions of these languages, and these are not necessarily conlangs because they are based off of original dialects, but they're also not reconstructed languages or proto-languages. They are often productions of languages that we don't actually know what they sound like ancient Egyptian. We have guesses, but we're not entirely sure. So this is productions that are similar based on modern languages, I presume. I don't actually know if there was a linguist working on the show. But the linguistics does play a significant role in the story itself. Some of the problems that the characters encounter have to be dealt with using linguistics or archaeology in order to understand things, and it becomes significant. You hear examples, you see examples of this written word of these languages, and you understand that each alien culture that they encounter has their own language. However, later on in the series, the production of new languages drops off, and only pieces of languages that we've already seen are presented, and even those are infrequent, because you are presumed to understand that the language is present and that it is important. So I don't believe these languages are full languages. I have not delved into the fandom to see if people have taken the languages and analyzed them. I'm just telling you what I have experienced and seen in the shows themselves and with my knowledge as a linguist. Now, moving on to Babylon 5, which is sort of entirely different while being very similar in that the language it shows up, but it's not all the time. Babylon 5 takes place on a space station with multiple alien cultures interacting. Now, they speak English 90% of the time because it is an Earth-controlled station, and English is sort of the common language of the galaxy. Now, when interacting with people of their own species, each alien sort of produces, they produce snippets of a language at first. And the first, every so often you hear them produce a language and you get the translation and subtitles on the bottom. And after that, it is presumed that they are speaking in their own language when they are interacting with people of their own species. However, you don't often see the production of that outright. You occasionally see snippets of script and text that is, translated or being read, but you don't actually see it. And the reason that this is different than Stargate is because it is it's like a giant city. You wander around and you hear people speaking all sorts of different languages, but it's in the background and it's not necessarily central to the story. Whereas in Stargate, the language itself was actually central to the story. You see the production of the language, and these are not as fully fledged as some of the ones that you see in Stargate or in Star Trek, but they are still present and perhaps more intricately woven into the story because it's sort of expected to be background knowledge as opposed to a story element. There are many examples of conlangs in sci-fi in both books and movies. Things like 1984, where George Orwell has his Newspeak, and Clockwork Orange, where Anthony Burgess has his NADSAT, or in Star Wars, where, as linguists have gone in and analyzed, the language doesn't actually make sense according to the rules that we are aware of, but may make sense in some alien culture. Or things like Star Trek, where you see things like in the new series where Klingon is actually spoken by the actors and the characters, and you see the translation in the bottom in subtitles, where they won't speak English with one another unless it's for a purpose. These are all just different ways of looking at conlangs and putting them into the stories. They're different amount of exposure to the languages. Star Trek will have a much higher exposure of the language than, say, Babel 17, which has almost none, but it's more central to the story. And you also see different exposures between the film industry and the print industry because of the ability to experience the language. In film, you can hear the language, you can see the language. In books, it's a lot harder, and you have to understand that some of the things that are written or transcribed are really hard to pronounce unless you know how to pronounce it. You have to be aware of the limitations of your media and the ability of your readers to grasp onto this concept within the space that you've got. So overall, all of these pieces, whether print or film, provide enough information about the language to be interesting and relevant to the story without overwhelming the watcher or the listener or the reader and requiring them to hold languages in their heads. They're believable, the use of the language is believable without being overwhelming, provides characterization for individuals, for people, for the show, for the books, my dog. And generally speaking, if people want to know more about the language, they will ask, or they will speculate, or whatever. I mean, there are fandoms dedicated to understanding Klingon. There are websites that people have put together on the use of language in sci-fi novels. I mean, there's a huge amount of resources out there, but it's not actually in the piece itself, unless you want in subtitle form or in a language gloss, or if it's actually relevant to the story to understand how the language works. So I hope this was informative, I hope this was helpful, and if you have any questions about conlangs, specifically the ones I've talked about here, please let me know. I will try to put up links to resources for creating conlangs and for places where you can find information about some of these conlangs, and I will put them all in the description box below. That was Conlanging in Science Fiction. I hope you enjoyed, and I will see you next time. Bye.